And this is Mind Shifting Monday with Mitch. And today we're going to talk about a topic. It's interesting to me. I was going to say it's a really interesting topic, but and I guess if you're here or you're watching the archive, you might find it interesting too. But to me, it's why we have problems dealing with complexity. Uh, so why is it we can successfully put a rover on Mars? We can send men around and women. We can send people around the moon. I mean, these are all complicated engineering feats, but we struggle to stop cell phone use in class. We struggle to end student apathy in school. Um, we struggle to successfully implement a new schedule. And really, the reason is we treat every problem like it's like a math equation. There's a single right answer. But real life isn't like that. There's no manual. There's no textbook. There's no ready answers. And that's because in real life, there's many different types of problems. And yes, some of them really do have answers. If I'm thirsty, I can reach for a glass. I can take a drink. Except that I'm looking around here and there's no glasses. And I'm tethered to the computer. So maybe that's not such a simple question either. And there's a framework for how we should classify problems. This framework was originally developed by a person named David Snowden, um, and he described that there's really four different types of situations. There's what we gravitate towards, which is the types of solutions we gravitate towards, which are simple, where you look at a problem, the answer seems obvious, there's one right answer, maybe there's a couple answers that would work, but basically anybody could look at it and come up with an answer. And it's very human to assume that all problems are like that. Second type of problem is complicated. Well, in a complicated problem, there could be more than one right answer, and the answer isn't immediately evident to people. Like maybe it takes an expert to determine what to do, or maybe it takes more information. You have to gather information, or you have to analyze information. And very often, there's more than one right way. So, building things are all complicated problems. You're sending people around the moon is a complicated problem. You need expertise. You need a lot of data. You need to plan. You need to figure out what are the eventualities, what could go wrong, and you need to be able to compensate for that. But if you do everything right in a complicated problem, you know that the solution is going to work. There may be 500 different ways of building a car, but you know that if you get the right experts together and the manufacturers together, that eventually you'll come up with a car that works. There may be trade-offs. One car may have luxuries, another car may be faster, another car may run on gasoline, but any of them will work in terms of getting from one place to another. That's what a complicated situation is. A complicated situation or complicated problem is where you can find an answer. You're not necessarily going, there isn't necessarily a best answer, but if you pull together the right people and you have the right resources, you're going to solve that problem. And you would solve that a little bit differently, because the simple problem is like there's one way to solve it, you just do it. And everybody else should be able to see it. In a complicated problem, you may have different ways of solving it, and you may have to make trade-offs. And it's a lot less important which solution you use than that everybody pulls for the same solution. And then there's something very different. There's the complex problems, and in complex problems, that's the type that we as humans hate, because we want certainty. And in complex problems, there's no answer that people know in advance. If you really want to improve education, there's no one right answer to do that. Nobody really knows what's going to improve our whole education system. Nobody knows um, how to pick a spouse. Um, Nobody knows the right way, the one right way to bring up kids, or to discipline kids, or to get kids to do things that you want them to do. Those are complex situations. Every situation is different, and in those situations, we have to be comfortable dealing with nuance, dealing with ambivalence, and dealing with the unknown. And that's just not the way people are. Um, As a matter of fact, I would say, and well, not just me, but David Snowden would say, and most experts in problem solving would say, is that virtually every situation that involves human beings, that involves emotions, that involves group dynamics, every single one of those situations is complex. And the reason is because people act, react, and evolve unpredictably. Simple policy changes will have unintended ripple effects. We may say one thing and somebody blows it, out of proportion, and we may find ourselves canceled. Um, so so the fact is that as humans, we find these types of problems that are complex very difficult because our natural tendency is to gravitate towards the one right solution. And yet, these are the types of situations that we face most often. And when we face a problem, we should understand a little bit about human neurology there, because the word problem itself is something that triggers our survival instincts. And when our survival instincts, our survival brain, or our limbic system, um, you know, starts coming to the forefront, where that system is very binary. Something is either right or it's wrong. It hates ambiguity and it craves simplicity. And so, when faced with a messy human problem, our brain tricks us into viewing it as a simple problem with an obvious fix, believing that anyone who disagrees is wrong. Now, it was really interesting over the last, I guess, 12, 24 hours. I had a perfect case of this. So, some of you are seeing me on Substack because I'm on Substack and I'm on LinkedIn. Uh, but I posted a video on Substack about how the issues we face in education have been exacerbated by the fact that we view them as simple problems, and our attempts to solve them as if they were simple problems really make the situation is worse. And there's no one solution that's going to fix education. If we really want to move education forward, we have to change our mindset. So I got a response, and here was, I'm going to read the response, and then my response is to this person. So this person responded, as a scientist and K 12 education expert, the solutions here are relatively simple. For example, we need to have a national agreement as to what our K 12 objectives are. Instead, we have 50 states' objectives. It's just absurd. Just show me a straightforward, comprehensive list of all major K 12 issues. After that, show me where that list has been prioritized. No one seems to be going after solving this in a logical way. Well, actually, that's exactly how we get into trouble, because here we have this person who says, this is relatively simple. All we have to do is come up with the biggest problems in education and prioritize them. And it wouldn't matter specifically what he was suggesting, but just the fact that here's an expert who's suggesting the right way to solve the problem, that's where we run into trouble. So here was my response. Nothing is simple. I'm not sure I understand your comment. So his reply back to that was, it seems like my comment, as you must have read something different from what I wrote. I never said simple. I said relatively simple. Big difference. And the word big was in capital letters. Okay. So, there is, it's not just that there's a difference between something being simple or very simple. There's a huge difference, a qualitative difference between something being simple or something being complicated or something being complex. Simple means that there's a solution. Complicated means that there's one or more solutions that we can eventually arrive at. Complex means that there aren't solutions. Nobody knows what to do. So, um, somebody saying, relatively simple, to me, that's like saying, a little pregnant, not very pregnant, just a little. Basically, a person is pregnant or they're not pregnant. They're going to have a baby or they're not going to have a baby. So, my question back after this, I never said simple, I said relatively simple, was, well, how complex is relatively simple? So, I'm kind of, having a little bit of fun with this, because obviously I'm playing on the word complex, which is very different from simple. Um, and really, this is exactly why education experts are way. Oh, I'm sorry. His response was, "This is exactly why education experts are way off the mark." And I'm reading that and I'm thinking, didn't he just claim that he was an education expert? Is he saying that he's way off the mark? But okay. Anyhow, he's in the simple mind, and you can see how our simple mind works. Things are binary. I'm right, they're wrong. Education experts don't know anything. Oh, I'm an education expert, so I know everything. Okay. So anyhow, he continues. Relatively simple means that profoundly significant K-12 changes will happen by an agreement on one sentence. Implementation of that one sentence would also be relatively simple. And I'm thinking, isn't that wonderful? If we all can agree on one sentence, then we can fix education. You know, and I know I got that assurance from an expert, so it's got to be true, right? But I decided, I'm going to continue, I'm going to play along, and I'm going to enjoy this. So my reply was, none of this is simple, relatively simple, or even remotely simple. And even if we come up with an agreed upon objective, the objective may be like so many slogans that become mouthed yet fail to lead to meaningful change. We all agree in principle that people should operate with integrity. And yet, look at where we are now. So his reply is back to me. Mitchell, thank you for providing a perfect example of why we are not making real progress with reforming the K-12 education system. You you definitively say none of this is simple, relatively simple, or even remotely simple. He's right there. I did say that. Okay. So you remotely say this without a clue as to what I am advocating. Open-mindedness is necessary for progress. And you teach and write about mindsets and mind shifting? And then there's three exclamation marks. So I just figured, like again, I'm going to have fun with this, and I left one more response. Well, which is, well, it's a good thing you're so open-minded. Then I guess we balance each other. And so writing that, I'm thinking, this is exactly something my mom would have said. Usually, the person she's directing her comments like that to, they take it as a compliment, like, "Oh, it's a good thing you're so open-minded," and so they're happy. And my mom would know that it was sarcasm, so she was happy too. So as of now, that's the way it goes. But take a look at the situation. What we have is an expert with a solution to a problem, and that's what we naturally gravitate towards. But the problem is complex, and there aren't any cookie cutter solutions. This is one of the traps we repeatedly fall into. And our limbic minds operate so that once we latch onto a solution, we regard any challenge as a threat. Then that threat floods our brains with adrenaline and cortisol, and they cut us off from critical thinking, exploration, creativity, and curiosity. And those are the very skills that we need in order to solve these big problems. So our survival brains identify a problem, then they go into survival mode. They devise the solution. They give us the certainty that this action is the only one that's going to work, and that we have to defend against any data, any feedback, or any arguments that come up. And then that very cognitive human process, um, that process is one of the central topics in my book. Mind shifting, stop your brain from sabotaging your happiness and success. So why do these simple solutions fail? It's because we crave that quick fix. We think we see the problem and we go after it. If you have dandelions on your lawn, the quick fix is to just cut the dandelions, but that doesn't get to the root of the problem, right? Because so the root's there, so the dandelion pops up 3 days later. So it's not you haven't solved anything. You just temporarily made it look like you were doing something. So you know, so some examples, like there's you know a district, and this actually came up from one of the participants in one of the mind shifting classes. Her district wanted to save money, and so they looked at their budget and says, oh, look, we have to cut some position. We can't cut teachers because we have to have this number of teachers per student, or students per teacher. So um, So they came up with a very strict formula to cut paraeducators. Simple solution. But the result, since this is a complex system, it was thrown into chaos because it's the paraeducators who are running the special education. It's the paraeducators who are monitoring the safety risks. It's the paraeducators who are taking care of the kids when the parents need somebody to work one on one with their kid, who are transporting the children. So a simple rule broke a very complex system, and then they had to go back and figure something else. So another example, somebody's studying for their financial advisor exam, okay, and this was another participant in one of the mind shifting classes, okay, and um, he just kept on taking course after course, and he would try the test and he wouldn't pass the test, and it was depleting his savings because he couldn't get a job as a financial advisor until he passed the course. So the firm that he was going to go with, they had this simple solution: if you're not passing the test, here's another book, here's another course, study harder. Those are all simple solutions. But all those solutions really ignored the complex reality that he had certain learning styles. His ability to take in information required him to learn the information in a different way that was standard in the books and the courses. And so once he could take a step back and say, well, how have I learned things in the past? What can I try? And come up with a couple things to try. In 3 months, he was able to change the way he was studying, try a few things. Some of them didn't work, and eventually something worked. So what are some of the ways to avoid this simple thinking? Well, one, and I tried this with somebody who reported to me. I guess this is going back probably 20 years ago. Is what I call the rule of three options. Okay, because the brain is looking to jump to a single simple solution, we can force ourselves to come up with three possibilities. Now, three is an important number there, three or more, because when we come up with one, we're regarding it as a simple solution. When we come up with two, we're creating a binary. One's going to be good and one's going to be bad. And our brain, our survival brain, our limbic system is really operating in this binary mode. So if we come up with just one other alternative, we're probably still operating from our limbic system. But three is something beyond what the limbic system can operate. And very often, once we come up with a third one, a fourth and a fifth possibility surface very quickly. So the story in using this is, I was running a company, and one of the managers, we had a problem with one of the courses, and so I asked one of the managers to come up with a solution on how we would um, how we would get better evaluations on this course. And the solution that she came up with was to change the survey that we gave to the students at the end of the course. So if the survey asked them simpler questions, then the results on the survey would be correct. And so my response to her was not to criticize that solution. My response to her was, okay, that's really interesting. And what are other things that might work? And she says, well, I just came up with a solution. I said, yeah, I understand that. But, why don't you take a day and why don't you come up, see if you can come up with two or three other solutions that also might work. And then we'll just talk about those solutions and you can pick the one that you think is going to be best. And so the next day, she comes in my office. She says, well, that was really amazing. She says, if you had told me that that was a stupid solution, I would have just fought you. She says, but by me coming up with some other solutions, it was like, oh my gosh, this doesn't meet the problem. The problem is that the course isn't teaching what it's supposed to be teaching. So how do we change the teaching techniques? How do we change the curriculum? What do we have to do to change the examples? And she came up with three or four things that we could try, and we chose one, and that happened to work. Um, and we were able to really dramatically improve the way that course was taught. So that one method for changing changing us from coming up with simple solutions to allowing us to look at complexity. One simple way of doing that is to force ourselves to come up with three solutions rather than to just choose the one. And then Um, and then another thing to keep in mind is that, very often when we have a problem, our our inclination is to find some expert who can help us solve the problem. But what's interesting with complex issues is that experts are very often the worst person who should be driving a decision. It's not that we don't need experts to stop us from doing something stupid, and it's not that experts can't be valuable, because in any complex situation, there's if it's a large situation, there's areas where expertise can be really helpful. But an expert is a person who's gotten very good about doing something a certain way. Experts are almost always deeply vested in their methodologies that they know well. There's a hammer. There's a question like, to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They revert to studying, pulling historical data, writing massive reports, and relying on what they've always done. Okay. But when we want to solve a complex problem, nobody knows the answer. And so this expert who's going to be driving their version of what to do is not the person who should be in charge. The people in charge should be people who can pose, what are three things that we could do? What are the concerns of everybody in the community? What do the users think? What do the owners think? What do the managers think? What do the teachers think? What do the parents think? And then come up with certain things that might help in um, throughout the situation that we can try, that we can try and aren't going to make the situation worse. Because there's another aspect is coming up with what we want to do. One of the screens that we should use is, is is that something that could conceivably make the situation worse, or is likely to make the situation worse? And if it is, maybe we should go back to the drawing board and come up with some more. So if people have comments on complex situations that they've been involved with, um, where or situations where they're sure that there's one right solution, I won't yell at you, um, uh, but I'd be really curious to see those in the chat. So if you have some examples of complex situations that you faced, where you weren't sure what to do, and you stayed in a curious mindset, or you didn't stay in a curious mindset, and you tried that one thing and it didn't work, I'd love to see them in the chat. So, um, since we're looking at probes or tiny experiments that we could do when we have a complex situation, another technique that very often is helpful is something called the three stories framework. And in the three stories framework, it's you think about the problem, and then maybe you come up with a solution, or two or three solutions. And before really thinking through how those solutions would work, you come up with three stories. So one story is you imagine, well, in all three stories, you imagine yourself sometime in the future, like maybe a year down the road or 3 years down the road, depending on the nature of the problem. And story one is it worked. And then you go backwards and say it worked. And then here's the situation today that it worked, because you're imagining yourself 2 or 3 years in the future. And what did I do to get there? And what did I do to get there? And what did I do to get there? And one of the things that's interesting about that part of that story out of the three stories, the it worked story, is that by thinking through what worked, you'll also start thinking through, well, what are the things that might not have worked? Um, and you'll be able to come up with ways of avoiding those. So the first is the it worked story. The second story is you imagine yourself a year, 2 years, 3 years down the line, and it didn't work. It failed. And this might be called the pre-mortem, because in a post-mortem, you're looking at somebody who died, and you're coming up with, well, what caused the death. So here is a pre-mortem. Nobody died. It didn't fail, but you're imagining it failed, and then you're trying to figure out where exactly did it fail. And going backwards from it failed will give you a chance to see, well, what could have caused it, and then from to fail. And then from there you can start coming up with, well, what can we do to overcome these and make whatever we do that much stronger. What are some other things we can do? What should we bolster? Should we add more people? Should do we need more resources? Did we need more training? Um, so the second story is the pre-mortem, or it didn't work. And then the third story is to imagine that again you're in the future, but while you were doing this, something weird happened. Okay, like, oh my gosh, there was this virus and it shut down the world for 3 months or 6 months. Okay, or there was an earthquake, or some building burned down, or somebody won a lottery. But something weird happened, and then you go like, how did you adjust to meet whatever weird thing happened? And the fact of the matter is, you know, as you go through your project or your solution to your problem, that particular weird thing is not what's going to happen. But just the fact that you considered that a weird thing could happen and that you were able to adjust means that you're looking for weird things and you're prepared to adjust. So that's a second technique for improving the way we deal with complex situations, and that I call that the three stories technique. Is to imagine yourself three years in the future, and you come up with three stories on that time frame. One, it worked. What did I do? Two, it didn't work. What did I do? What happened? What could I have done differently? And three, something really weird happened. And how did I react when something weird happened? So this is something that we teach in the resilient mindsets course, resilient mindsets for long-term success. And so, one example was Jessica. So, she was teaching, and her students weren't paying attention, and they weren't getting involved during science class. So, she knew that she tried all the solutions. So, what she did is she imagined trying something, but then she jumped forward and said, "Well, if that works, what did that change in the class dynamics?" And she came up with a couple things that it would have changed. And in coming up with those things, she came up with a few ways to make that implementation a little bit stronger. And then she imagined, well, let's say that's a couple weeks from now and it didn't work. Why didn't it work? And so she came up with trying it, and she could imagine why kids weren't paying attention even though she was trying this thing. And she came up with some wrinkles to her plan that would make it more compelling for students. And then she imagined something weird happened, like the classroom, the network went down for 2 days, and she couldn't. And her implementation was actually using virtual reality. And so she imagined, how would she handle that if the network went down for 2 days when she was trying to implement this? And so now, armed with things that could have gone wrong and how she would have reacted, she implemented the solution as a tiny experiment, expecting, hey, it might work, it might not work, but I have a couple other things that I could try. And sure enough, it worked, and she was shocked. But just the that process of preparing using that three stories framework made it, a lot more, made her solution a lot more effective. So, one other technique, and I think because everything is threes, right? So we have come up with three possibilities, use the three stories, and so the third three is to use the three sage questions, um, and that's to steel yourself that whatever since whatever you do might not work, is to prepare three questions for yourself about that thing. So, here's my problem. Here's what I'm going to try. It might not work, but if I try this, question number one is, what can I learn? Question number two is, what can I practice? And question number three is, what am I going to do next after this doesn't work? Now, what am I going to do next? Could be that you're going to try another thing, but it could also be that, something, I tried this. I just want to reward myself. I'm going to have a chocolate bar just to reward myself for trying. So, those three questions, you're going into something, you're prepared that you're going to try something. It might not work. So you prepare these three questions. What can I learn? What can I practice? And if it doesn't work, what am I going to do? So, um, so we covered, the biology behind why we treat complex problems as simple. We a couple of examples where people really did uh, think that problems were simple. They and the solutions didn't work out. Especially the person on Substack who was responding as an expert, telling me that you can't believe experts, but I'm an expert, so you can believe me. Um, and so we covered three different ways of improving our chances for success. One is to come up with at least three possible things to do. Second is to use the three stories technique to imagine it succeeded or it didn't succeed or something weird happened. And the third is the three questions that we can ask to stay in our sage mind, our resourceful mind. What can I learn? What can I practice? And what am I going to do? Now, most of this is actually based on the book, Stop Your Brain from Sabotaging My Happiness and Success. And we're going to be having a four part lab to talk about these techniques and other techniques associated with being more resourceful. And that lab is going to take place on June 3rd, June 10th, June 17th, and June 24th. It's free. So if you're interested in the lab, um, then that QR code on the screen, which is it takes you to a Humanitics registration page, gives you more information about how we're going to conduct the lab over those four sessions. And I think that you're going to find that if you attend, you'll be able to use many of the techniques in this "Stop Your Brain from Sabotaging Your Happiness and Success" book, in order to be more resourceful, in order to look at situations as complex and not get thrown when the first thing that you try doesn't work out. So this is Mitch Weisberg. I hope to see you next week. Actually, I hope you have a great time next week in the US. Next week is Memorial Day, so we're going to be off also. We are going to return on June 1st, and we're going to be talking about breaking the win lose cycle at work, at school, and at home. So have a good week and hope to see you in a couple weeks. Take care.